My Bigfoot sighting occurred on our dairy farm in Shenango County, south of Bainbridge, New York, in May 1961, when I was 14 years old. The sighting was around 1 p.m. in the afternoon, in our family hillside woodlot, which was made up of primarily oak, maple, cherry, and peach trees. At the time, I was active in Boy Scouts, and having my own campsite was a priority. I located my campsite next to a small spring. Now, to a 14-year-old boy, this meant all the comforts of a home and a campsite. Plenty of wood for campfires, plenty of water, and plenty of protection against the elements in this section of woodland. I was going to the campsite when I heard a rustling noise at the spring. Thinking it might be a deer coming in for a drink, I moved as quietly as I could in the underbrush. Instead of a deer, about 50 to 100 feet from me, up rose this coal-black form, looking directly at me. At first, I couldn't figure out what was looking at me. My brain just couldn't sort it out. It wasn't a bear. In the shade of the trees, its eyes reflected a brilliant yellow, and his coat was shiny black. Very broad shoulders, no neck to speak of, and his head was rounded like a human's. What bothered me was I could not discern a face. It seemed covered in hair. The eyes seemed to be peeking out of hair that fell over its face. Its arms were at its side, and I could not see below its torso, as brush covered its lower half, so I could not see its hands or feet. It had a very broad trunk. It would estimate its height to be 6 feet. It just stood there swaying side to side looking at me, as if to say, "What am I looking at?" Just as I was. It never made any sound. Now, I heard of Bigfoot. Old Dad had a subscription to a True magazine, and I had read Ivan Sanderson's stories, Jerry Crew, Ray Wallace, and John Green. But Bigfoot lived in the Pacific Northwest, not the East. When it dawned on me that I was looking at a Bigfoot, sheer panic and fear gripped me. I blasted out of there like a rifle shot. I ran down through the woods to a 4-strand barbed wire fence that separated the woodlot from a Christmas tree plantation, and cleared it easily in one jump. At this point, I lost my sweater that I had tied around my waist. It had warmed up considerably that day. I continued to run through our Christmas tree plantation, cleared another fence, and when I reached an open pasture, I looked back, and nothing was following me. I made it back to our farm buildings in record time, about a half-mile from the sighting location, when I realized I had lost my sweater. If I recall correctly, my parents and younger brother were away at the time on a shopping trip in Binghamton, New York, and I was by myself. I decided to go back for my sweater, so I went back to our farm shop and got our trusty Stevens single-shot shotgun for courage. I knew it would not kill, let alone stop a squatch, and went back after my sweater. As I approached the fence where I lost it, I could hear something walking up the fence line, and must have known I had come back, because it sounded like it was stomping branches as if to say, "Don't come near me, stay away." I found my sweater neatly draped over the strand of the fence, and tried to follow the Sasquatch up the fence line. There were several times I knew I was getting near him, but could not bring myself to get closer. Finally, I gave up my pursuit and went home. As I review this event, I would say I probably surprised a juvenile who was drinking at the spring. I would estimate it was a male, as I saw no breast or female feature. Regarding the hair hanging down over his face, I note that Loren Coleman has written about this feature of the Ohio woolly booger or other eastern sighting. It could be that he came up so fast from getting drink that he didn't have time to slick his hair back. I've told few people about that event, and later I told my family I had seen a bear. I note that many after a sighting are afraid to go back to the sighting location. I was never afraid to be alone in the woods. However, I noticed that in early February or March, I would feel at times as if I were being watched. However, it seemed that was the only time of the year that I felt uncomfortable. Since I moved to the Northwest in 1987, I have kept up my investigation. However, I have seen nothing like this since. Yet, I have experienced a couple of incidents where I believe I heard howls or calls. My name is Steve Keller. I am from Atlanta, Georgia. My brother and I bought about 30 acres of land about a year ago on Pressman's Home Road in Rogersville, Tennessee, very close to the intersection of Highway 66 and Highway 94. It is pretty mountain land, and we hope to build cabins and eventually retire there. The land is very wooded with just several old logging roads going through it. Last week, Dave and I spent 3 days clearing trees at the top of his property. We also set up a couple tents to camp there. The first night, there was nothing unusual. The second, about 10, we heard this very loud calling or howling not too far from our tents. It sounded like maybe a couple hundred yards away on the next parcel of land, which is very rugged. I started up and everything got silent, and a minute later we heard a similar sound coming from way off in the other direction. This went back and forth several times. Then it broke into an ongoing howling session for about 5 minutes. I have camped many times and I have heard all kinds of howling, owls, coyotes, dogs, etc. But I have never heard anything like this in my life, nor had Dave. We were getting ready to pack up and get the heck out of there. But we were both exhausted from cutting trees all day, so we decided to stick it out. It really freaked me out though, knowing the only thing protecting us from whatever it was this nylon tent. I finally went back to sleep. The next morning, Dave told me he had slept out all night, and it started back again, down at the bottom of our valley about 3 a.m. Apparently, it was very loud, and our neighbor's dogs went crazy barking at it. Don't know how I slept through it other than I was exhausted from the day before. The next day, we discussed it and how it had really freaked us out. We had the idea that we would try to record it the next night on our iPhone. The next night we did hear it, just an owl. We left the next day. Okay, a couple of things that are unusual that add to the picture. 1. Since we bought this beautiful property, we have seen virtually no wildlife on it. No squirrels, no deer, no rabbits, no chipmunks, no nothing. The only animal that we have ever seen in over a year is one turkey and a couple of snakes. It is such a pretty place with so much vegetation that we were really starting to wonder what was wrong with it, that no animals would come there. Was it a toxic dumping ground? Something had to be wrong with it. So it was very unusual to hear any kind of animal howling on the property at night. Number 2. A couple from Florida owned both the 2 lots next to us. This sounded like it was where the howling was coming from that night. They, along with the father-in-law, were down this spring and trying to stake out their property lines up between the mountain. The father-in-law was further up the mountain when a rock about the size of a baseball came from out of nowhere, flew over his head and was headed for Carl. He yelled for Carl to duck and the rock just missed him by inches. Originally, we all thought it must have been a rock that came loose from the top of the mountain and came rolling down. The likelihood of that is very unlikely because of all the trees. Since our experience the other night, I am really wondering if maybe it could be a Bigfoot living on Carl's land, which is very rough terrain. Could it be that a Bigfoot threw a rock at them that day? Could it also be that the reason there are no other animals anywhere on the property, that there is something living there that is scaring them off? I listened to some Bigfoot recordings on the internet when I got home, and several of them sounded very similar to what we heard that night. We are going back in a couple of weeks, but I doubt we will camp in the mountain again. First-time poster, long-time lurker here. I came across this thread and thought I would share a story I've heard many times growing up in the Georgia deer woods. I'm actually quite surprised that there seems to be a lot of these stories that are coming from Hancock County. Not saying I believe one way or the other, but I just find these stories interesting. Especially the ones from Hancock, because that is where this story took place. Back in the early 70s, my dad and all of his half-brothers hunted something like a 3,000-acre tract behind the Devereaux store. The story goes that they were longbow hunting, or at least Archie White was, possibly could have been beer drinking, and night road hunting to knowing my family. Anyway, it has been said that Archie headed out for the evening, with a long bow and quiver and a couple cans of beer. My dad has been adamant every time the story was told that while he was drinking, he was not drunk. Sitting on the ground, backed up to a tree, he dozed off when he awoke. There was this creature standing directly over him. Ugly, hairy, and mean-looking, and awful smelling. On the other end of this story, from the brothers' perspective, just at dark from their camp on a power line, they hear screams and see Archie running for them. No bow in hand, just holding what was left of the quiver and a couple of arrows. They say that to say he was shook up as an understatement, and more like he was freaked out to the point that he was, for the lack of a better word, crazy out of his mind. He was screaming about what had happened, all the while throwing his gear in the trunk of his car. They hunted out of cars back then. He told all of his brothers that he was leaving and they were crazy if they stayed, and that he would never hunt again. He never did. Uncle Archie passed away some years later on his deathbed. He told my dad to come to him so he could talk to him about the incident many years ago. He said he took a lot of kidding about that over the years, but he wanted to tell my dad that what he saw and what had happened was the truth. Just my story about the handcuffed deer wood.
Hello, I am writing to your website because of some strange going-ons about the place I own here in Prescott, Yavapai County, Arizona. We have the remnants of what used to be a working ranch from years ago. Some living livestock from those days, a few horses, a few Brahma, a couple of goats out there, and a longhorn I won in a bar fight in Mexico, down in Limestone County, Texas. And recently we think we have a Bigfoot around. We used to winter horses for people around these parts who are snowbirds, but no more because of the mystery disappearances that happen here. In fact, lots of mysterious things like that happen around the place, especially as fall nears and the weather cools, like September, October, and November. Nothing happens in summer out here. One notable incident was the disappearance of one of my best dogs, part pit bull / shepherd mix. He wasn't afraid of anything and was a great watchdog for the lower pasture. He guarded the grazing stock and 2 sheep we used to have and the goats from the local mountain lions and bobcat. Now, you may say the dog wandered off, but he was 10 years old and never left sight of the main house. He was a devoted dog. Some have said a bear came in the forest at night and took him, but my middle son found him exactly 14 feet up in the crotch of a pinyon pine tree with his neck snapped. No teeth marks were found, no bear claw marks, no mountain lion tears, just a broken neck and tossed up into that tree. Or if not tossed, someone must have put the dog's body up in that pinyon, which my son had trouble reaching. We all tried to explain that one. Now onto the sheep. I bartered with a half-breed for a ram and an ewe, and had them down in the grazing pasture along with the stock, horses, goats, and such. We only had them for a short while and they disappeared. For a while we thought the previous owner snuck back here loading up the 2, carried them off, but my wife ran into the fellow in the hardware store in town and talked to him about the disappearance. He came home that day with my wife together and we went looking for a sign. We found nothing that day, and I don't believe he had anything to do with the sheep disappearance. He told me a far-out story that got me thinking though, which is why I looked up Bigfoot on the internet. Anyway, he told me of a place up in the Sierra Prieta Banduresa forest, where this Yavapai Indian woman ran her small flock of sheep into the company of a young cousin, a blue Merle Collie and a border collie that kept her flock together at night, fending off attacks by mountain lions and bobcat, sometimes Wolverine. This one season, the woman and her cousin were bringing down the flock down the mountains from grazing. It was late October. Snows were expected. She said she was not feeling well and laid down in a grassy meadow to rest, but woke up when she heard the sheep bleating, her cousin yelling, and the dogs loudly onto something. The woman, sheep herder, said, escaping with a big ewe under his arm, the hairy man tried to fend off the biting dogs. Kicked the one coolie dog. All to hell. This might be what befell my dog. She caught off the dogs and watched the hairy man disappear into the pines with his prize. He explained the hairy man to her was what we call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. She only told the story once to an outer and she won't speak of it anymore, but he mentioned they come down from the north in winter. Hearing the sheep hoarder's story, putting two and two together, my sons, the half-breed, and I pretty much decided that we must have a rogue Bigfoot living somewhere near the property. I don't mind that so much. We don't mind sharing some fruit off our trees with him, but stealing a man's stock is another thing. I don't expect to put up with that. After reading up on your website, my boys and I, along with other dogs, packed a rifle and a scabbard and rode out recently in the morning during Thanksgiving week and covered the whole western stretch of the property line, looking for a sign. You would laugh. We looked like a posse in a B-Western. We worked the edge of the tree line for about 2 hours looking for a trail. We found one that led deep into the forest, a section none of us have ridden before. We worked the horses through there and around thick brush. Soon we came to a stream and stopped to gather our bearings and water the horses. Dismounting, I thought I heard someone cough. I asked and nobody heard it but me. My horse jerked up, snorted, and became uneasy. Sensing something none of us could see, the other mounts followed. All of us were focusing on keeping the horses under control as they danced about, bucking, kicking, and snorting. My sons thought mountain lion. I wasn't sure. We stood together there by the stream listening, calming the horses when the dogs started looking towards the thicket of tangled brush. Then the barking started in earnest, and they took off. Still, we couldn't see anything, but by now we all expected the dogs to tree a mountain lion. We couldn't follow. The brush was too thick, but the dog noise seemed to be about 20 yards into this thick brush and brambles. We kept calling and calling. Finally, the dogs returned and then took off again. Pretty soon, the dogs returned with tongues hanging out, breathing heavy. We leashed the dogs up and took them and led the horses down to the stream. The dogs settled down, but the horses didn't. And as we were making an effort to saddle up again, that is when it happened. There came this howl that lengthened into a scream that at first sounded like a Brahma fart, low and guttural, and drug out and ending up into a high-pitched drone like a woman screaming bloody murder. My body reacted with a chill. The goosebumps, mainly because the scream was coming from very close, somewheres in that thicket of brambles where the dogs had been. The scream was long and kind of dragged out, the kind of noise that gets your attention real fast. The half-breed yelled, "Soyongo," which means Bigfoot, as he pulled the rifle out of the scabbard. By now, the horses were almost impossible to control. Then it got quiet. Not a sound, no birds, no crickets, no nothing. Everything was still, except for the horses. The dogs were now cowering between my legs and their ears pricked towards the thicket. Then, in the distance, we heard another scream. It must have come from across the next valley. Now, we are figuring there is fixing to be 2 of these Bigfoot, and I felt fear for the first time. The dogs started whining. My grown boys hurriedly saddled up. We followed and took off down the trail, heading at a full gallop all the way home a good hour later. Ain't never heard nothing like that vocalization before, and I've heard plenty coyote, plenty wolves and elk bugle, but never nothing like that before. And it wasn't no mountain lion scream. It was 4 times as powerful. If that was warning from a Bigfoot, we got the message. In 1977, while fishing, my Uncle Bill, my Uncle Shep, and my Aunt Cora, now deceased, and my mother Mary were fishing the original Loop Road area of the Tamimi Trail. They were all fishing in this heavily wooded, swampy area, just talking and laughing as family members do when enjoying time together. It was a sunny day, but the overhanging tree line made it cool and filtered the sunlight. Loop Road has loads of wildlife and is in the Everglades National Preserve, home to the Misuki Indians. Loop Road is an excellent place to fish for bass and bream, or just take photos of nature and his keep. One Saturday at approximately 2 p.m., Uncle Bill says he ran out of night crawlers, so he decides to go back to the car, which was parked a few feet away from where everyone was fishing. He said he unlocked the trunk of the 1977 Pontiac Grand Prix and grabbed the small plastic container of night crawlers and began to close the trunk, when all of a sudden, he saw a figure some 40 feet away walk out of the tree line on the same side of the road everyone was fishing on. It stopped mid-stride and looked at him. As he peered along the trunk lid, it stood looking at my Uncle Bill for 3 seconds and quietly walked across the dirt road and into the tree line swamp on the other side. Uncle Bill described it as being 5 feet tall and having long arms to the knees and was covered in a long thin fur. He said you could see the light-colored skin through the fur. Bill said that the face was flat, with a flat nose, and that the hair was around the eyes and below them, and around the mouth. He says the eyes seemed like one dark color, and Uncle Bill's words, it scared the hell out of him. But he also said the most amazing thing was that this thing never made a sound. It didn't crack a branch as it walked out of and into the swamp. Uncle Bill said he made everyone quickly pack up their poles and hop into the car, and he quickly drove off. He has never been back to Loop Road before his passing. Myself and my brother always go out there today, but we have never seen anything. Please know that Uncle Bill passed away. Ain't he nice? Well, the story I'm going to tell needs a little foundation. I was 15 the year this happened. I'm Native American and I live in the northern Nevada, in a rural area, so I grew up near animals and the outdoors, and I was a Boy Scout, so I knew how to identify most of the Nevada and Idaho wildlife. But this story I'm going to tell just ruined the outdoors for me. Every time I go camping or hunting, I will think of this every time. I smell garbage or a skunk. But when this happened, I was hunting with my brother, my 2 uncles, and my dad. We were going on a 3-night hunting trip. Where we were going had rivers, valleys, canyons, cliffs, and forests. Where we were camping was on the edge of the woods in a valley. It was our annual campsite. In the valley was a river that cut through the middle and ran into a natural lake that held trout, bass, and whitefish. When we had nothing to do, we would spend our time swimming or fishing. The water was cool and clear and attracted a lot of wildlife. I once watched a mountain lion and her cub drink the water. I heard all these stories about mountain lion attacks, but they are timid and shy. It was the second evening when we were sitting at the camp, by the fire, joking and laughing when we were punched in the face with a putrid odor. It smelled like a garbage dump on a warm day. That was sprayed by a skunk. Then my uncle said, in a scared tone, "Let's go into the camper." I just did what he said and laid down and went to sleep. It must have been around 1:30 in the morning when I awoke to hear our trailer rocking in the same odor that we smelled earlier. I was confused at the rocking. At first, I thought it was a cow that was pushing his head against the side of the trailer, then thought of the look on my uncle's face and his scent shows on my spine. I tried to go back to sleep when I heard footsteps on the roof of the camper. I needed to use the bathroom, so I grabbed my .22 250 and slowly opened the door and glanced around a little bit. Then I took off for the side of the camper. When I stopped and looked at the roof of it, there was a black figure that was crouched down and staring at me with red glowing eyes. I was scared to death, so I fired a round in the air to scare it off. It hopped from the position onto the ground and bolted for the tree line. When it got there, it looked back and let out the ugliest, most blood-curdling cry I've ever heard. And I wish to never hear that cry again. I still go hunting in those woods, but have never went out at night or near that spot yet. For most of my life, I lived in a small town in Fairfield County, Connecticut. I wasn't new to scary stories about ghost intruders and stalkers, but what I saw was far from that. It all started in January of 2011. I was waiting at the bus stop earlier than I usually would, so nobody was walking down the street. The morning felt off, but I shrugged it off as I thought it was the loneliness. But that quickly turned to fear as I heard a scream that sounded like a lowered pitch, stretched out yell of a coyote. It immediately sent shivers down my whole body. I wish the story would end there, but it didn't. After school, I would usually hang out with my friends. For anonymity, I will call them Liam and Charlotte. Liam, Charlotte, and I would proceed with our usual shenanigans down by the brook in the woods. There was a small bridge that would lead to a thicker woods that we'd go to build teepees and little forest and just hang out. As we were halfway through the bridge, I heard that same bone-chilling yell. "What the hell was that?" Coco asked, sounding concerned. We all looked at each other and said it called a day, as we quickly walked out into the light. We went up the snowy hill. That's when I caught our eye. A 8 to 9 foot tall creature that had brown hair and a Hulk-like build covered in hair. What was shocking is that it ran across the brook in 2 steps. The brook was about 32 feet across. We froze at what we saw and ran up the hill across the other side of the bank. The footprints in the snow were bigger than any humans. I can't find any explanation of what it could have been. It couldn't be a bear or a human. Not even an escaped ape. This incident still freaks me out to this day, although I still go into the woods. I've never seen the creature or have heard any other accounts of this creature, so I'm hoping others can relate and give some closure and proof that I'm not insane.
This happened this past Thursday evening, right before Destination Truth comes on at 9 p.m. in my time zone. I am staying at my brother's place 2 doors down from where I live because I'm getting new floors put in my condo. For those that don't know, I live on a bluff that overlooks a river on the edge of a city in South Carolina. My brother was on the deck looking at Jupiter when I saw him through the window motion for me to come out. I went out and noticed a plane flying low overhead, but could still hear scuffling and pebbles hitting the tree line over this noise. My brother did a couple of owl calls. Then I tried my barred owl call. That is when the deer jumped over the edge of the bluff and cut across the yard, at an angle going towards the outdoor light. It was being followed by something that was below the edge of the bluff. It must have seen us and got royally pissed because it hissed. Now, the edge of the bluff is about 30 feet from the deck, and I would guess this creature was 10 feet below that gradually sloped edge. But you could hear it very plainly because the plane was gone by that time. A few seconds later, we caught a whiff of a sewage/sulfur smell, but it evaporated pretty quickly. Now, what do you think it was? Will a puma that isn't supposed to be in South Carolina hiss like that and put off a smell that tomcats will? Would they come that close to city limits looking for game if it's a puma? I never saw what it was. I just could tell what the direction that the hiss came in. The moon was not very high yet, and the outdoor light was a good 50 feet away. I looked this morning but couldn't find any prints or sign of struggle. It hasn't rained in weeks. I assume the pebbles could have rolled down the slope hitting trees and the boulders on the way down to the water's edge. A game trail if something was scrambling up the hill. The only thing that I can think of that can hiss like that is a big cat, but I didn't think they would wander that close in. Maybe it was following the river because of the drought and other prey that would be doing same thing. I used to work with this guy who'd always go walking with his dog in the woods of Windsor, Massachusetts, very late at night. He always used to say that the quiet of the late night is very relaxing. He'd always tell stories about weird things that he heard or animals he'd seen. But one morning he came into work and he was very shaken up, like something terrible had happened. We asked him what was wrong and it took him a moment to answer. "I was out with my dog last night in the woods. We were walking along the trail and there was a hill in front of us. I hear something coming down the hill which startled me. I looked up and saw what looked to be a man coming down the hill. That scared me at first, but as it got closer, I noticed it was covered in dark fur and was taller than an average man. It had a terrible musky odor to it that burned my nostrils. As it came down the hill, it noticed being my dog. My dog's hair was standing up straight as an arrow, and I put my hand in a fist and brought it back to be ready to defend myself. Not 2 seconds later, it let out this very loud howl and ran away on its hind legs to the west faster than anything I had ever seen in my life. We all stood there, eyes wide and jaws dropped, waiting for him to say something else. He finished with, "I know one thing. That's the last time I ever go in those woods." And he went to his area and got to work. Let me know where you guys stay.
Having lived in the area for more than 4 years, I had become accustomed to and familiar with driving my ATV, a Honda 450 Foreman, in and around the Daniel Boone National Forest. I was 22 years old of age and I was dating a local girl who lived in that county her entire life. We will call her Pam. We left my house one October night, traveled to the end of my ridge road, which is gravel, then continued on the dirt logging road, no longer in use at the time, which is privately owned. This road, of course, was wide enough to have, at one time, accommodated trucks and machinery used for logging. This old road goes for maybe a mile to a mile and a half eastward before splitting into 3 separate roads, each having several arteries branching from them. We stayed on the eastward path that runs into the Daniel Boone National Forest. From this point, there is an old house trail that the locals use for their equine excursions. We had traveled the entire horse trail and all the logging roads many times. I felt intimately familiar with every nook and cranny of these paths offered. Pam and I motored down the horse trail at a leisurely pace due to the narrowness of the trail among the thick forest trees. This, coupled with many twists and turns of the horse trail, one could rarely exceed 8 to 10 miles per hour. I know this was because the ATV had a digital MP3 readout that was a backlit for night travel. After 200 to 300 yards, we came upon a small pond that sits on the south side of the trail. This was a fever spot of mine. Many times I would travel to this spot at night, turn off my lights and engine and just sit there and gaze at the stars and take in all the smells and the sound effects the forest offers. I saw my first shooting star while gazing up in the fall sky the year before in this very spot. This small, circular pond sits in a very tiny clearing of the forest just off the horse trail, with a tree line only about 20 feet from the water's edge all the way around. I pulled around the side of the pond opposite the trail, under a clear and half-moonlit sky. I turned off the engine and lights. I was oblivious that we had just parked near an entity that did not want us there. Fortunately, before we could even lift our butts off the seat to get off the ATV, there was a tremendous roar that came out from the tree line directly behind us, probably no more than 40 to 50 yards away. I was instantly terrified as this was a sound I had never heard. It was loud and near. Pam screamed as I started up the ATV and headed back down the trail toward home. Luckily, the trail back out of there lay right in front of us. Holding on to me from behind, Pam remained silent as we made our escape. As quickly as I could, and without hitting any trees, we made our way back to the logging road, a few hundred yards away. I never remembered turning my body to look back, but I looked from side to side many times. This model ATV has 3 headlights. 2 are in a fixed position on the four-wheeler's front, and the third is attached to the handlebars, and thus turned from side to side several dozen times as we made our way back to the logging road. From the pond to the logging road, I saw nothing unusual on either side of the tree line, neither directly nor in my peripheral. But remember, the horse trail is on forest property and the trees much more densely populated. Even with the ATV's lights and a half moon, my vision would have been severely limited. Either of us spoke to one another during the retreat of the horse trail. During this time, I remember telling myself over and over that it must be some kind of animal or even bird that had made that awful noise. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the logging road. It greeted us with a straighter, wider path and sparsely populated trees. Now comes to the recollection that haunts my dreams to this day. Having reached the logging road without seeing or hearing any signs that we were being pursued, and not wanting to wreck, of course, I only moderately quickened our pace. Now, on the south side of the trail, something caught my eyes. I saw a dark figure running parallel to the road directly to my left about 30 yards. This thing was running on 2 legs. It looked like a very tall and very large human form. I looked directly at it for a few seconds, turned back to look at the road, and then turned to look at its direction once more to discover it was still there, keeping pace with us. During the second and final glance at this being, which also just lasted a couple seconds, it was one of those moments in my life where you wonder if what you were experiencing is real or just a dream. I looked down at my large digital backlit speedometer, 22 miles per hour. Finally, a moderately sharp bend in the south of the trail. I had to slow a little. As the road straightened again, I floored it, and for the first time, I turned my body to look to the left and a little behind to see if the curve to the left had allowed the creature an advantage, in case it was upon me or even in front of me. Nothing. It was not in close proximity to my left or rear. I even scanned the trees to my right. Nothing. I cocked my head to the side and yelled over to the sound of the engine, "Pam, did you see it?" These being the first words I had spoken since the encounter. She must have thought my abrupt acceleration was due to the fact that beyond the sharp turn in the trail we'd just passed, the road did become more straight and smooth. Her response in my ear was, "I didn't see anything. Did you see something?" I said no, with intentions of telling her everything once we reached my house. I slowed my pace, and within minutes, we were on the gravel road which led home. We went over the experience again and again that night, but I never told her what I saw. I sold my four-wheeler and moved into the city the next summer of '99. I purchased another ATV in 2000. I bought a trailer and pulled my ATV to the 49 exit off I-75 and do my riding in Laurel and Rockcastle counties. I hauled my ATV back to the area I saw the creature on a summer day in 2001. I was alone. I went to the pond and stood on the bank for a few minutes. I skipped a few rocks and then left. It was a beautiful day.
March 2nd, 2007. The witness had just gotten off work early and was traveling down 200 North. One of his co-workers was traveling in front of him, a good 300 feet or so, when he noticed that he had swerved rather fast. So the witness expected a deer to come running out, but that was not the case. What he saw was a black furred animal on 2 legs walking all hunched over. He quickly tried avoiding it, but he believes he clipped it with his back end. He stopped, not sure what had just happened, and started looking for his driver's side mirror. He didn't see anything for a few seconds, but then something stood up right behind his Explorer. Terrified, the witness rolled down his window and could see the fear on his friend's eyes, who confirmed that he had seen the same creature. His friend started back to see it and heard it howling. The witness looked through the windshield and saw the creature was trying to stand up on 2 legs again, but kept falling over. It eventually got on all 4s, ran off into the woods. The 2 men then got out of their vehicles to look around but did not see anything. However, they did notice a large, fat moose gerbil-looking rodent on the side of the road, which was not afraid of them at all. They picked it up and put it off into grass. My sister, Natalie, and I decided to take the 4-wheeler out after dark against my father's words. We followed the trail from our property into the McMillan Marsh. There, we were able to run along a dike system between water reservoirs. It was midwinter and my sister Nats was driving the 4-wheeler and I was riding shotgun behind her along the dike. It was lightly snowing. Dark grew in fast and we were suddenly surrounded by darkness and snow with 2 headlights to show the way. Suddenly, a large 7 to 8 foot creature walked up onto the dike in front of us about 50 yards away. It stopped, turned, and looked right at us. We both noticed how the wind blew the long light brown hair, about a foot long, on its side apart, and it was white underneath, as the hair parted from the wind. Our 4-wheeler nights were not high enough to see the face, but it had a large, muscular chest and arms and walked like a man. The chest was a little more hairless, so that you could see rippling muscles under the dark hair. It had very long arms and did not walk like a human. It sauntered along, totally unafraid of us. It swaggered with very long arms swinging at its sides, and then went off the dike and into the wilderness. We were shocked and horrified. We sat in shock and then thought over where its location was. There were very large footprints in the snow. We hurried home and never told a soul till years later. We compared what we saw, and our stories were exact. We will never forget that night. It was not a wolf, a bear, or anything human. I stand by that with my soul. If it were just me, I would have blown it off as a figment, but Natalie has every detail to the exact of my own.